It started for me, I sort of got my feet wet, and more than that, in fact, when I went to look at a coral spawn. Has anybody here ever seen a coral spawning? Has anybody ever? It's one of the great wonders of nature. It's one of the things that biologists, marine biologists, sign up for when they're undergrad, so that they eventually get to see one. They're quite uncommon for scientists to look at, and it wasn't until just perhaps 15 or 20 years ago that we even knew that they happened, that corals spawn this way. But I was trying to figure out how this weird system worked of the ocean, and it was a mystery to me. So I tracked down one of the scientists who works on this stuff, and her name is Nancy Knowlton. She now works in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian Institution. And then she was in Panama looking at a group of corals that she'd looked at year after year after year as they spawn. And she said, well, why don't you come down? We'll look at these things. So I got on a plane, went to Panama, and I said, but how do you know when they spawn? And she said, well, we think they spawn. We're pretty sure that these ones we're looking at are going to spawn 5 to 7 days after the last full moon of summer, 100 minutes after sunset. And I said, yeah, really? And how do they know when to spawn? These are little, they don't even have a brain, right? They're just cells, soul orifice cells, little, like anemones, but with a crust underneath. And she said, we don't know how they know. It's one of the great scientific queries, is to try to figure out how these guys know when to spawn. And she said, we're never really sure if they're going to do it, because they have their own magic. We never really know if they're going to spawn when we think they are, but we're going to go and try to find out. So there were like 24 of us. Most of them had PhDs. So think of the brain power, the educational assets under the water. So night after night we would go and see if these things were going to spawn. And this is a rite, some sort of ritual of birth that's been happening for, billions of years probably on the planet. Not with those individuals, but with creatures like them that have been living in the water over time, that send up this genetic material to try to make baby corals or baby creatures of that type. And it was very clear to me that we were on the cusp of witnessing something that was the magic of regeneration somehow. Except that year, the year I went, had been a very warm year in the Caribbean. It was in the Caribbean side of the Panama, and the corals were in trouble. They were bleaching. They were sick, and we weren't sure whether they were going to spawn. In addition to the whole timing issue of like, when do corals actually spawn? So there were all sorts of us. You can imagine. They were scuba diving. I was snorkeling over top. It's dark. It's like getting to be 100 minutes after midnight, after sunset, and we're peering down at these little animals to see if they're going to spawn, see if they're going to send up their little bundles of sperm and eggs. They're hermaphrodites, so they send up both at the same time. Night after night we went, night after night there was nothing. The night they actually did spawn, we got into the water, and it was electric with sexual energy. And I tell you this only because you're a United Church crowd. Normally I don't talk about this stuff. But let me tell you, we got into the water that night, and you could feel the electricity running. It was an absolutely stunning event. And sure enough, at exactly 100 minutes after sunset, these guys started to release their little bundles of sperm and egg, and they rose to the top, and there was a funk that filled the Caribbean that night. All these little creatures eating and spawning, and it was food. And we were all excited. We followed some of these little coral babies, these embryos, along the water, and captured them in plankton nets and took them back to the lab and looked at them to see how many of them would actually get to the 16 cell stage, which means that they're viable. And we were calling ourselves Team Spawn, and we were looking at these things under the microscope, and we were thinking that we had really witnessed something pretty marvelous. Except that we realized once we started counting that only half of the corals that night that should have spawned did, and only half of the ones that did spawn made embryos that would have survived under any conditions. So maybe in the whole history of marine life, this was pretty good. But to us that night, it felt as if we were watching the dance of death in that ritual of birth. And that story continued as I researched every other part of the ocean, every other piece of the ocean I looked at, every other vital sign, every other system as if you send the ocean to the doctor and the doctor does a workup, every single vital sign of the global ocean is going in the wrong way, is going toward disease, toward unhealth, not towards this big, vibrant system. And I thought to myself, well, so what does that really matter? Does it really matter that any of that is happening? And I went to talk to a fabulous scientist named Boris Worm, who lives in Halifax. He teaches at Dalhousie. And I said to him, so what if, so the ocean isn't healthy? Is that a big deal? And he said to me, well, let me put it this way. If everything on land were to die tomorrow, everything in the ocean would be fine. Better. If everything in the ocean were to die tomorrow, everything on land would also die. He said to me, we are fully dependent on the ocean for our life's breath, for everything that happens, for the carbon cycle, much of the oxygen cycle. Every second breath of oxygen we breathe comes from plankton, as you've already heard. And I had never understood that we were that dependent on it.